understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and the podcast today is going to come in two parts, today and on Thursday, and both parts are going to be dealing with the economic history and the economy of Japan, because this week marks the 80th anniversary of the dropping of two nuclear bombs on two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which marked the end of the war in the Pacific. Japan is the only country to have suffered a nuclear attack on its soil. And against that background, we're going to just talk about Japan. It's a country most of us don't know very much about, incredibly important economy, society, absolutely crucial in the theater that is that part of Asia geostrategically, but also from an economic and manufacturing perspective. Japan, Japanese cars, Japanese gadgets, Japanese everything have been part of our lives for many, many decades. So we are going to talk about the history of Japan with Russell Jones, who was an ex-boss of mine for many, many years. He's written a fantastic book called A Modern Economic History of Japan. And we're going to talk to Russell in a couple of minutes. So that's a two-parter today and on Thursday on the economy, the society, and the geostrategic importance of Japan. Johnny boy, how are you?
I am good. I'm good. I'm still buzzing on the news that we are going to be appearing down in the Electric Picnic this year.
John and I are going to be
two outlads at the
but you know, the funniest thing is this is my 20th Electric Picnic.
Is it really? Wow.
The 20th. I have been hosting the Leviathan tent in Electric Picnic since 2005. I think it's the second Electric Picnic. John Reynolds, who passed away a couple of years ago, asked us down to start Minefield. We've been doing it ever since. But John, you and I are going to be on the podcast tent. No, actually, we're going to be in a big tent. 5 o'clock. Friday, the opening day of Electric Picnic. If you want to hear the David McWilliams podcast live, turn up at Minefield, 5 p.m. Friday afternoon for chat, for gossip, for analysis, for all sorts of carry-on.
I think Fatboy Slim is our support act.
He is, yeah. Yeah, well, we're a pair of Fatboy Slims or Slim Fat Boys or whatever it would be. Okay, so anyway, that is John and I at Electric Picnic. We'll talk to you about that in a couple of weeks' time, closer to the date. But we would love to see you if you are going to EP.
Yeah. So, Marco, what else has been going on this week? What's rattling around your head?
I'll tell you what's rattling around my head is, do you remember Chemical Ali?
I do, yeah.
Right, so Chemical Ali.
There are no bombs. There are no bombs.
Yeah, he was Saddam Hussein's information minister or disinformation minister, right? And of course, Chemical Ali's job was to tell Saddam Hussein what he wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Now, this weekend, Donald Trump has, in an extraordinary move, fired, can you imagine this, the chief statistician of the American Department of Labor, right? Her name is Erica McIntyre, right? She was a PhD in economics, public servant, a brilliant economist and statistician, and it was her job to collate what is called the non-farm payrolls every month. Now, the non-farm payrolls are the most observed indicator of where the American economy is going. They're basically
these are the job figures.
Jobs, yeah. So jobs in the non-farm sector, right? So it's a combination of survey data. It's been accurate for years and years and years. The statisticians are public servants. Their job is just to tell the story, just to give the number.
Yeah.
Which is how many jobs have been created in the United States. Donald Trump didn't like the latest one because he felt that the number was too low, that he wanted a big employment number. So he wanted the
beautiful
United States,
employment number.
Big, beautiful number. He wanted the United States economy to generate, let's say, 250,000 jobs, right?
Yeah.
When you drill down into the data, what you see is the American economy is slowing very rapidly on an employment perspective. Over the last 3 months, on a seasonally adjusted basis, it's only producing about 35,000 jobs, which is very, very low for the United States, okay?
Because they had big numbers earlier on in the year, didn't they? They had, in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you, so the figure for July was plus 73,000, right? Donnie didn't like that.
Yeah.
So he
Rigged.
fired the actual messenger. He fired the actual messenger. He shot the messenger, right?
Jeez.
And he said that the figures were rigged. So in one swoop, he's undermining the entire economic infrastructure and establishment in the United States. And he's going to put a patsy in there, a chemical alley, who's going to massage the figures upwards. Now, the problem for the world is that the financial markets look at these figures as an indicator of where the Federal Reserve is likely to go on interest rates. So this is why
Right.
they're so crucially important.
Yes. Yeah.
If you drill down the figures, basically the American economy is what you could call at stall speed.
Yeah.
It is not growing fast enough to actually drag the economy in any notional place. So in particular, the figures on unemployment, John, tell us, how many people are hiring, how many people are available to work, all these very, very crucial indicators. The last 3 months, on a seasonally adjusted basis, the American economy is creating about 35,000 jobs per month. That's very low. In the previous 6 months, if you look at the same figures, about 87,000 jobs per month. So what you're seeing is there's been a sharp fall in the last 3 months in the average seasonally adjusted amount of jobs created.
Yeah.
Donnie doesn't like this, so he fires the economist. But I mean, this is the sort of thing that all dictators do.
Yeah.
They massage the numbers, they change them.
But the numbers don't lie, Mac. I mean, are you saying that, this department is the only department that has access to like the definitive numbers? I mean, does it not become obvious to everyone when Social Security receipts goes up, for example, and there were more people on the street looking for work? I mean, is that not kind of plain as day? Like, no matter what a chemical alley might be saying,
What I'm saying is that for the last 40 years, on the last Friday of every month, the non-farm payrolls are released at 9 a.m. American time, Washington time. Every single president has recognized the integrity of statistics. I'll give you just an observation. Really civilized societies have really good statistics. I know you find this really weird, but statistics are the foundational number of all societies, because without statistics, you can't measure progress. Without precision, you're into the world of makey-uppy economics. Without numbers, you can't create an edifice against which to actually base policy.
Yeah.
And what Donnie is saying is, I don't like the numbers. I don't like the numbers. I'm going to get somebody else in. So basically, what he is doing, he's attacking the evidence.
Yeah.
And that comes back to the idea of, your truth is not my truth. Right?
Yeah.
It's like,
bullshit. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So a weird week to start talking about economics, but it's Donnie J. What can I say?
Well, and let me tell you something else about Donnie J. He's got into this extraordinary spat and exchange with the former Russian president, Medvedev. But what it's about is Medvedev made some inappropriate or threatening comments. And on the basis of that, Trump has shifted 2 of the nuclear submarines to appropriate regions, he says. And then there was this back and forth on social media. But here's one of the things that Medvedev said, which is kind of a bit scary. He said, he, as in Trump, he might as well recall his favorite films about the Walking Dead and also remember how dangerous the mythical dead hand can be, he added with a laughing emoji. The dead hand is the launch mechanism for Russian nuclear missiles. If the leadership is taken out, they're launched automatically.
Wow.
Like, it's extraordinary.
The one thing I know about Medvedev is his name is Mr. Bear, which is kind of appropriate for a Russian leader, because a Medved is a bear in Russian. Okay,
right,
so there you go. And number 2, Deep Purple played his 50th birthday party. So there you go.
No way. Really?
Yeah. He's a heavy metaler. Sorry, he's a heavy metaler.
Oh my God.
Right,
wow.
Okay. So basically, Donnie J has YMCA. Your man has Deep Purple. Go figure.
It's smoke in the water, man.
Exactly. Anyway, speaking of nuclear, let's go and discuss Japan, because this week marks the 80th anniversary of the only time nuclear bombs have been deployed and attacked and landed on humans ever, which was this week in 1945. And I want to go and talk to Russell Jones. Now, on the line from London, I have not only an old friend, but a man who risked his reputation by giving me a job, which, in fairness, is always a high-risk strategy from a person in a conservative investment bank. But many, many years ago, my first boss in the United Kingdom was none other than the chief international economist of UBS at the time, Russell Jones, who I'm not sure if he's got over the trauma 30 years later of having to sort of negotiate, to husband, to curate, to keep this young fella out of trouble. But it is great to see. And I'll just give you a little bit of background on Russell. He has spent 40 years at the top end of economic analysis across a variety, not just of countries, but a variety of continents. When he debased his currency profoundly by giving me a job, he had just come back to the UK from a stint in Japan. He then left to go back to Japan. Japan has been his, not so much life's work, but certainly a country that he has lived in, he has worked in, he's understood, he has analyzed. And now he has produced an amazing, amazing book on the economic history of Japan, which Martin Wolf, who we know is probably one of the greatest arbiters of good economic narratives. It is one of Martin Wolf's summer economics reads, which is basically FT economic book of the summer. And Russell is in Barnes, a house I've been in. I can recognize it. Russell, how are you? Great to see you.
Great to see you, David. And flattery, as always, gets you absolutely everywhere with me. So thank you for that introduction. Very kind.
As you know,
it's all lies, but thank you.
No, it's all good. Now, listen, Russ, let's get into Japan. As I said there at the start, when we met 30 odd years ago, you had just come back from Japan. You were the chief international economist of UBS. And yet I always felt that Japan was a place where part of you resided in. You've now written this modern economic history of Japan. Let's start 120, 130 odd years ago. Japan is a feudal society. I want to get really deep into it because we can do all the tariffs, the non-tariffs, the what's happening with Japan right now. But I want listeners to get a sense of how much knowledge you have about this place. So let's go back. Japan is a feudal society. It is an isolated society. And in around 1860s, it begins to have this dramatic change. What is that? It's called the Meiji Restoration. Remind us what that is.
I think what it boils down to is an exercise in self-preservation, actually. The US Navy had turned up in the middle of the 19th century and with all this technology and had threatened Japan. And the Japanese authorities thought, if we're going to avoid becoming subservient to the Western powers, the US, European powers like the UK and Germany and so on, we're going to have to build our economy up. So it was really an attempt to try and avoid becoming just another colonial nation. And Japan was an incredibly proud country. It had been a bit like the UK, an island nation. It hadn't been invaded for a very long time. Although it had shut itself off, it had huge pride in itself. And what it didn't want to be was just another colony at a time when, the major powers were just accumulating colony after colony. And it took the decision that in order to avoid that fate, it would have to very rapidly develop itself. And what the Meiji Restoration really did was take all that they could find, all they could learn from the economies, the world economies that were dominant at the time, and try and integrate them into their own society, into their own country. And they did a phenomenally successful job at it. Just to give you an example, the central bank was modeled on the Central Bank of Belgium. You wouldn't quite believe that. They took their constitution from Germany. They learned where their military was concerned from all the major powers. So they were applying a lot of knowledge which had been accumulated over time in other countries. They also themselves decided that if they were going to be a major power, they themselves had to colonize other countries. And so they fought a series of wars against countries in their immediate hinterland. I mean, they destroyed the Chinese in the last decade of the 19th century in a war. They were the first, if you like, Asian country or underdeveloped country, if you like, to defeat a major power. When they defeated Russia in the first decade of the 20th century, they acquired land in Korea, and essentially Korea became the Japanese colony by the beginning of the First World War. So, they learned a lot from the powers that were very strong, not just the good bits, but unfortunately, you could argue some of the bad bits as well. And they also, I think, adopted a sort of political system which was focused around the empire, but really was focused around the military. The military were really running the show. Over time, I'm afraid that sort of curdled into the horrors of the middle of the 20th century. But it was something that, at the beginning of their development, they used very much to get the population on side, to give them a goal, to give them a target for the future. But it was an extraordinary period of economic development. I mean, Japan really was the first country ever to escape economic backwardness. And they did it in a remarkably short period of time.
I mean, I think this is an episode that many Westerners are not aware of, this unbelievably rapid development. Now, other countries were going through it at the time. You can argue the Germans were going through it. The British had obviously led the way 100 years previously, maybe 150 years previously. But as you said, this was the first, what was regarded as non-European, or what I would call proto-European societies. Like the Americans are sort of a proto-European society. You can argue the Aussies, the Kiwis are in fact European adjacent, or were at least at that stage. But this is the first non-European society that emulates the Europeans, so much so that it actually surpasses the Europeans in many areas.
Yeah, very true. I mean, there were, as ever, certain serendipitous circumstances came along, of which the most obvious one was the First World War, which Japan didn't really get involved in, although it sided with the Western allies, with the UK and France and the US and so on. I think it got a couple of German colonies in the Pacific, and that was about it. But because everybody else was so absorbed in fighting the war, it allowed it, or was given the latitude to move into markets which had hitherto been dominated certainly by the UK, for example. And it had a remarkable period of expansion during the First World War. Growth rates which were far in excess of anything it had before, and far in excess of any other country. It built up a big external surplus. The First World War was a very good war for Japan. Unfortunately, what came next was a little bit more challenging. It started to really encounter some racism. And if you look at episodes like the Versailles Treaty and the Paris Peace Conference that went along with it, Japan was treated pretty appallingly by the Western powers. And what also happened is, once the First World War was over, it lost a lot of the markets which it had managed to inherit from countries like Britain and so on. And the 20s were a very, very difficult period for Japan, a period of stagnation, a lot of internal unrest, banking crises. I mean, really, the precursor to what happened in the 1990s happened in the 1920s. But it continued to expand, and it continued to develop. It continued to, build new industries and so on. I mean, it wasn't a completely dead decade, but it was a more challenging period.
Russell, can I ask you, many people, because I want to go, it's a whistle-stop tour through a century's history of a very complicated country. But can I ask, economically, what was behind the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor from an economic perspective? Because that's the one that, many people say, hold on a second. Are you serious? You're actually going to take on the Yanks in the Pacific, where they have a massive military and a massive naval advantage? What was the economic logic behind the Japanese expansion in the Second World War?
Japan, as it is today, was dependent upon foreign raw materials, commodities it needed to help its manufacturing sector to expand, and at that time to help its military sector to continue to run the campaigns that it was already waging in China and so on. The US and the Western powers had increasingly imposed economic and political sanctions on Japan at that time. And in particular, just ahead of 1940, they had cut off Japan's oil supplies from Indonesia, which was the primary source of those. And so I think the calculus in Tokyo at that stage was, we have to strike very quickly in a surprise fashion in such a way that we deal a major blow to the United States. You know, the US hadn't really done a lot of rearmament by that stage. It was way behind the curve. And the feeling was, you know, we give them a really big bloody nose and then they'll negotiate, and we can negotiate from a period of strength. At the same time as they launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, they also launched the attack on Malaysia and ultimately Singapore and on the British Empire, and absolutely gave Britain probably the biggest military defeat of its history. You know, the fall of Singapore was an absolute trauma, as traumatic to the UK as, you know, the strike on Pearl Harbor was to the United States. So, you know, I think most people, most sensible people in Japan at the time knew that, you know, if they got into a real arm wrestle with the Western powers, they couldn't win it. But the hope was, by striking quickly, you know, delivering these humiliating defeats, they could encourage the Western powers to sort of negotiate. Unfortunately, that calculation didn't quite play out as they hoped. And, you know, the US took a much more bellicose attitude thereafter than they had prior to that. And, you know, I've always thought that wars are typically won by GDP. You know what I mean? That big countries have the capability to last much longer in a major conflict. And if you were to add up the GDP of Japan, Germany, and Italy and put it against the United States, the United Kingdom, and the British Commonwealth in 1940, there was only ever going to be one winner in a long war, because the Western Allies had the biggest GDP. So, you know, once Japan's initial thrust into Asia had failed, you know, it was really a matter of time before it suffered a defeat. And boy, what a defeat.
And that's what I'm saying. So we're talking here about, you know, 80 years after the dropping of the first and then second atomic bombs on Japan. Let's talk about what the Germans describe as Jahr Zero. You know, we start again. How does Japan, from a totally defeated nation, from a totally humiliated nation, from a nation that is still the only people in the world who have suffered a nuclear attack, how does it go from there in 1945 to when I was first beginning to be aware of Japan economically, let's say in the 80s? And in the 80s, every second airport would have a book called The Rising Sun, Beware Japan, The Coming Japanese Force. How does it go from total defeat and humiliation to complete ascendancy, in effect, global ascendancy by the 1980s, as an economy, as a society, as a financial power?
Boy, that's a very big question, very complicated question to answer. I mean, first of all, you know, I cannot underline too much quite how devastated Japan was in 1945. The atomic bombs were just, if I can use the phrase, the icing on the cake, in the sense that, you know, there'd been this bombing campaign for the prior 6 months that had devastated every single urban center. The conventional bombing raids actually did far more damage than the nuclear weapons did, remarkably, not least to Tokyo, which was just flattened. There was one raid in March 1945 in particular that was just off the charts. You can't believe it. But yes, to your point, absolute devastation. Oh, boy, how did they recover from that? They were lucky. They had a sugar daddy, frankly. You know, the United States occupied it in 1945. Initially, the US tried to, if you like, impose some very liberal political conditions on Japan. They did this for about 2 years. They introduced a new constitution. They gave a lot of the people rights that they'd never had before. And in many ways, the Japanese population around this time had more constitutional rights than the US did, or US population itself did. And then in 1947, with the Cold War starting to brew, the US did a remarkable change, it's called the reverse course. and they decided, you know what, it might be a good idea to have a strong, economically powerful Japan in the Asian theater as our ally.
Yeah.
And so the US came in and they stabilized the currency. There'd been rampant inflation after the war. And certainly when the Korean War kicked off in 1950, they decided to use Japan as the major manufacturing hub to support the operations of the United Nations troops in Korea. And so there was a huge inflow, a huge demand for Japanese industry. And the Japanese knew how to build up heavy industry. They'd spent, the run up to the Second World War doing it. So there was knowledge there. But the US, was basically building up Japan for its own purposes. And once that spark had ignited in the early 50s, the US continued to be a strong supporter. It gave them a security umbrella that meant they didn't have to spend much on defense. The US actually helped to determine the nature of the political system in Japan. I mean, the suggestion is that the CIA put the Liberal Democratic Party in power in 1955.
Never.
And the Liberal Democratic Party, which was of the right, really remains in power to this day, although it's having a few problems at the moment. But it's been a dominant political party. And the US was very keen that it should be. At the same time as that, we had a very sympathetic international environment. World trade was growing rapidly, trade barriers were coming down, and that was great for a manufacturing nation like Japan. Japan had an incredibly competitive exchange rate. The yen was set at 360 yen to the dollar in the late 1940s, and it stayed that way until the early 1970s. And that exchange rate became progressively more and more undervalued.
This is great stuff. I mean, because I tell you, Russell, it's always fascinated me. I might just lodge this idea in listeners' heads, and we might come back to it at a later date. What I've always been intrigued after the Second World War is how America treated its enemies better than its friends. So Japan and Germany get treated incredibly well by America.
Absolutely.
Britain had to pay back all the bloody money. Britain didn't get any favor. It's a really weird thing, the way the Americans behaved after the Second World War. They said, like, our enemies, we're going to treat them even better than our friends. I mean, they were on a sort of a cultural war with the French for at least 30 years after the Second World War. But that's another different point. So, that's one for the comparing and contrasting American administrations then and now, God forbid, okay, in terms of their responsibility, their longevity. But let's come back to this point. So Japanese, you've got open trade, you have an industrial base, you have a sugar daddy, you have an undervalued exchange rate. All these things are pointing in one direction, which is an export miracle, in effect.
You also had an incredibly well-educated workforce. I mean, education is very highly valued in Japanese society, even before the Meiji Restoration. Literacy rates in Japan were far higher than they were in most countries. So, your workforce was well educated. It was incredibly well motivated to rebuild Japan, proud nation and all that. You had a bureaucracy that was very, very smart and knew how to channel resources into what I'd call a sort of industrial vanguard of companies. The big industrial conglomerates were given so many advantages by the bureaucracy, and that generated economies of scale and so on. The manufacturing behemoths moved into the global market and just ate it up. It was, an extraordinary combination of factors, a lot of moving parts, a lot of them feeding off each other. I think at the same time, the Japanese didn't make any policy mistakes, or at least not any egregious ones. They kept taxes low. They essentially, monetary policy was run very sensibly. There was quite a constriction of consumption so that resources could be channeled into investment. Huge capital accumulation in that period. The economy grew, at a double-digit rate in the 50s and 60s. They announced in 1960 the so-called income doubling plan over the next 10 years. They actually achieved it in about 8. I mean, it was mind-boggling.
Extraordinary stuff.
Absolutely mind-boggling. But, I think the international, to go back to the point I made, there was a sympathetic international environment, and the world sort of let them off a bit for some of the things they did. But, the fact is, you mentioned Germany as another country that was treated very well by the US. You've just got to look at where Germany and Japan were situated geographically. Germany's on the edge of Eastern Europe, on the Soviet bloc, and Japan is, very close to Russia in Asia. They were very important military or geopolitical hubs that the US was very keen to support. But yeah, there were a lot of factors coming together to help Japan to grow in the way it did. And the real sort of antipathy towards Japan only began to develop in the 1970s. The US suddenly started to realize, blimey, this is a competitor now. We better
this is
start.
we're not babysitting anymore.
We're not we're certainly going to babysit a lot less than we used to. And for example, when Nixon decided to abandon the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system in 1971, I mean, it came as a massive shock to Japan, because suddenly, their exchange rate started to appreciate very rapidly. The undervaluation was being corrected. I mean, Nixon also imposed a 10% trade tariff, something you may be familiar with tariffs, but Nixon did it before Trump did it. And again, that was a big shock to Japan. But, to go on with the positive story, the way Japan adjusted in the 1970s, both to the change in the exchange rate environment and to two big oil shocks, was extraordinary. I mean, the flexibility in the economy and the structural change that was put in place was remarkable. It still continued to outperform, even if it wasn't growing at 10% per annum.
Can I just ask you that flexibility? So if you contrast Japan's ability to ride two oil shocks reasonably well with Europe's inability, not just Britain, Germany, France, Italy, all these major industrial countries start to splutter in the mid to late 70s. The Japanese don't do this, despite an overwhelming dependence on imported. And is that because of the structure of societies, the discipline of the society, the way in which they're, how did they manage to do what the Europeans couldn't do?
I think that the, attitudes were very important. I think that certain institutional factors were very important. I mean, if you look at the Japanese labor market, for example, about a third of all wages are determined by profits, that's to say bonuses, and overtime. So when the economy starts to hit tough times, the wage bill automatically starts to fall because bonuses drop and overtime hours disappear. So wage inflation was adjusted much more rapidly to the two oil shocks in Japan than it typically did elsewhere. The Japanese were also very canny. For example, after 1974, they suddenly started giving a lot of money to Palestine or to Palestinian-related entities. They switched a lot of their oil demand to the Middle East from other places like Indonesia to try and stay on side with the Middle Eastern countries. So, they were smart. The institutions helped. The attitude of mind helped. And there was still, they were still, I think, getting a pretty easy ride, although the rest of the world was starting to see them as competition. Yeah, they were still treated better than most. They were still allowed a bit of a free ride in some aspects. But it was a very, very impressive performance. The Japanese economy could still grow at about 4% a year in the 70s and early 1980s, which, relative to, say, jolly old England, which was bumbling along at 2.5 if it was lucky, or the US, which was a bit more than that, was still a very impressive performance. Very impressive.
So now we get up to the 80s, and this is where some of our Irish listeners, the ears might prick up, because we are talking about the mother and father of a property boom, the mother and father of a bank stroke land stroke property explosion in Japan. This is where I first begin to hear about Japan. I hear that at a certain stage in the late 80s, the land upon which the Imperial Palace was built in Tokyo was worth more than the entire real estate of California.
Yeah.
How do they go from this incredibly disciplined, export-orientated, prudential policy, high savings ratio, massive capital formation, all the good stuff, right?
Yeah.
How do they go from that to channeling their inner Paddy and go mad with property? Okay.
Okay. I think the first point to make is that a lot of the underlying forces behind the economic miracle had started to fade. You know, the capital accumulation is always subject to diminishing returns, especially as you get closer and closer to the technological frontier. And Japan had caught up.
What does that mean in English? Capital formation suffers diminishing marginal returns as you get closer to the technological frontier.
All right.
Even I, who's apparently an economist, can't follow that.
Yeah. Well, you know, Japan had been built on an awful lot of investment, but the rate of return on that investment starts to diminish as you catch up with best practice. Okay. And best practice would, let's say the United States is best practice. So you've built up your industry through all this investment. Your industry is now is getting more and more efficient. It's getting almost efficient as you can. And that means the rate of return on that investment automatically or naturally starts to fade away.
Okay, I get you.
Okay. Another point was that a lot of Japan's high growth era had been built on very positive demographics. You know, late 1940s, early 1950s, Japanese families have got 4 kids.
Yeah.
You know, by the mid 1980s, they're having less than 2. So the population growth is diminishing. The population is starting to get older. And we're going to get onto that a bit later, I think. So those are 2 very powerful forces, the capital accumulation and demographics. They feed off each other. When they both start to slow, the economy starts to slow. So I think, as I said, you know, the economy's already slowed down from about 10% a year to 4% a year GDP growth. Come the 1980s, there's a lot of hubris around. You know, Japan thinks it's won. As always happens after very long periods of economic growth, countries start to get overconfident, and there was an element of that there. And at the same time, Japanese policymakers looked at what was going on in the United States and the UK and places like that, where you had the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism, and they thought, a bit of deregulation wouldn't be a bad thing. And unfortunately, they decided that the first place they should deregulate was the financial sector. And the financial sector had been...
This is like a drama where the villain, it's like a theater where the villain just walks in the back, Grim Reaper, and everyone's dun, dun, dun.
And he keeps coming back again and again,
Okay.
The financial sector had been incredibly controlled for 30 years to channel money into the manufacturing sector. And they decided to open it up. And at the same time as that, Japan was under increasing pressure to get its external surplus down. So the US and Europe were saying, you've got to expand your economy more. You've got to use fiscal and monetary policy to boost the economy. The Japanese themselves were very keen on tightening fiscal policy. So the only macro weapon that they used in its essence at that stage was monetary policy. And you ended up with very low interest rates at a time of rapid financial deregulation. Now, we've all seen that story before somewhere, And, the net result was an asset price boom, very rapid accumulation of debt, especially in the corporate sector. And 1985 to 1989 was probably the most egregious period of asset price excess in recent historical memory. It was an extraordinary period. It was bonkers, absolutely mad.
I mean, Ireland, we tried our best to emulate that. We really did. We really gave it a good go. But again, so for Irish listeners, the Celtic Tiger period of rapid increase in credit, complete deregulation of finance, very low interest rates because
Mhm.
we'd actually joined the euro. So straight away we get kind of German interest rates. We
Yeah.
hadn't had them before. We used to have more like British interest rates. We get this kind of interest rate massive cut. And as always happens, as house prices go up, FOMO hits people. People want to get
Mm.
involved. Everyone
Yeah.
tells stories of, you hear about your man, he bought that for 100 quid, he sold it for $1 million. Oh my
Yeah.
God, I'll be doing the same thing. Same thing happened in Japan. They also like the paddies. The paddies ended up buying property in Bulgaria and in all over the place. Japanese corporates in particular start buying trophy assets, golf
Yeah.
clubs, all sorts of things in the United States. And then it goes all tits up in around 1990.
Absolutely.
And what happens after that?
Let me give you an anecdote about the level of hubris that was running. I mean, I first started to visit Japan in the late 80s. I didn't actually live there until 1990, but I was visiting on a regular basis. And I remember going to see one fund manager, and by this stage, the Nikkei was very close to its peak, which was just under 40,000. I remember asking him, I said, so where do you think the Nikkei is going, Mr. Watanabe or whatever? And he said, I think 100,000 is a pretty reasonable estimate, as a target.
Yeah.
And, that didn't quite work out.
So where did it end up? So he's predicting 100,000. Where did it actually go in the
It peaked
end?
just below 40,000, and it on the very last day of trading in December 1989, and it didn't recover that level until about 18 months ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So let's just hold it there because I'm listening to Russell here. We're talking about a modern economic history of Japan, the book that Russell has just written. It gives us an extraordinary insight, as you've just got firsthand, of the story of one of the least understood societies, economies in the world, and one of the most important societies and economies in the world. It still is, despite everything, still in the top 5 economies in the world. It still is a massive financer, we're going to get onto this, of the United States. It still is a massive purchaser of American treasuries. All that stuff. It still is in the glare of Trump when it comes to tariffs, etc. But what I want to do is I want to stop us there. So we're here, we've got from 1860s to the peak of probably the most extraordinary financial bubble the world has ever seen. In the next episode, I want to start there with Russell, and then I want Russell to explain to us what has happened in Japan since then. So it's 40 years of absolutely breakneck growth, which comes to a crashing halt with a property stroke banking boom. And I want to hear now the next 40 years. So listeners, bear with us. This is our Japan week, middle of August. It's our Japan week. We will be back on Thursday with part 2 of our discussion of Japan with Russell Jones. Talk to you on Thursday.